The morning I signed the papers on the lake house, I sat in my truck for a long time before going inside. 43 years of getting up before sunrise, driving to job sites in the dark, pouring concrete in weather that had no business being called weather, and it had come down to this. A 2-story cedar house on the shore of Lac Saint-Pierre, a dock that needed one new plank and silence. Real silence. The kind you have to earn. I was 64 years old. My knees ached in the cold. I had $2.3 million in a registered account and a modest pension from the Provincial Contractors Association. My wife, God rest her, had passed 4 years before. And my daughter, the one I had built every single thing for, had not spoken to me in 11 years. I poured myself a coffee from the thermos I'd brought from home and looked at the water. I was okay. That's the part people don't believe when I tell this story. I was genuinely okay. It had started the way these things always start. Not with a fight, not with something dramatic, but with a slow erosion. My daughter had married a man named, I'll just call him my son-in-law, when she was 29. I had tried. I want to say that plainly. I had tried with him the way a man tries with a locked door. Politely at first, then with more patience than he knows he has. He didn't like me. I could feel it from the first dinner. Not dislike exactly, more like he had decided I was a certain kind of man before he'd ever shaken my hand. And nothing I did would change that file in his head. I was a trades guy. I talked too loud. I didn't have a university degree. My hands looked like the hands of someone who'd actually used them, which to him, I think, was embarrassing. My daughter started changing the year after the wedding. Small things at first. She'd cancel plans without much reason. She'd go quiet when I asked about their finances. Once, at Christmas, I made a joke, the same kind of joke I'd made her whole life, and she looked at me like I'd said something criminal. I still drove 4 hours from my place in Granby to see her in Ottawa every few months. I still called every Sunday. I still sent money on her birthday, and at Christmas, the way I always had, because it was the only language I had left that she seemed to receive without flinching. Then one November, a Sunday, she didn't pick up. The next Sunday, same thing. I left a message. I drove up the following month and knocked on their door. My son-in-law answered. He said she didn't want to see me. I asked if she was there. He said yes and started to close the door. I stood on that step for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then I walked back to my truck. She never called to explain. There was one text 2 weeks later. Dad, I think we need space. I'm sorry. I wrote back. She read it. I could see the read receipt and didn't reply. That was 11 years ago. I won't pretend those years were easy. The first 2 were the worst. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and lie there doing the math. What I'd done, what I could have done differently. Whether there was a version of me she could have loved without conditions. I ate badly. I worked too much. I had a stretch in there where I was putting in 60-hour weeks, not because the business needed it, but because the silence at home was too loud to sit with. But something happens when you keep going anyway. The grief doesn't disappear, but it finds a different place to live. It stops being in the front room. It goes somewhere quieter. I expanded the business. I hired 3 more crews. I landed a contract with a municipal developer in the eastern townships that turned into a 5-year relationship and eventually into a buyout offer I accepted at 62. The number was good, better than good. I bought the lake house because my wife had always wanted one, and I suppose I bought it for her the same way you light a candle for someone. Not because they'll see it, but because you need to do something with the love that has nowhere else to go. My granddaughter was the other reason. She was my daughter's child, which meant she was also mine in whatever way grandfathers are given these things. Her name was the only real name in my phone that still made me feel something uncomplicated. I'd seen her only a handful of times over the years. Awkward visits arranged through a third party, a neighbour of my daughter's who felt sorry for us both. My granddaughter was 16 now. She had a grandmother's eyebrows and the look of someone trying to understand a world that hadn't bothered to explain itself to her yet. 3 months before the lake house, the neighbour had called me. My granddaughter had reached out to her, not knowing who else to contact. Things at home weren't right. My son-in-law had lost his job 18 months prior and hadn't found another one. The money I'd once sent had dried up on my end. I'd stopped when the door closed, and apparently there had never been much saved. My daughter had gone back to work full-time, but the mortgage on their Ottawa house was steep. The arguments were constant. There'd been talk of taking my granddaughter out of her school program, the arts program she'd worked to get into, to save on transit costs. I sat with that for a long time after the call. I called a lawyer I trusted in Montreal. Not for anything dramatic, I just wanted to understand what I was and wasn't allowed to do, legally, for a grandchild whose parents hadn't invited my involvement. He laid it out for me. I made some notes. Then I bought the lake house. I had it cleaned top to bottom. I fixed the dock. I set up the second bedroom properly, with a real bed and a good lamp and a desk, because she was the kind of girl who would want a desk. I did not contact my daughter. I had learned by then that the only moves available to me were quiet ones. It was a Saturday in late September when they showed up. I had a few friends coming by that afternoon. My neighbour Gord from down the road, a woman I'd worked with years ago named Margot, a couple from the village I'd gotten to know at the hardware store. Nothing formal. I'd made a pot of chili and put some beer in a cooler on the dock. The leaves were at their peak, and the lake was doing that thing it does in September, where the light sits low on the water all afternoon. I heard the car in the gravel before I saw it. My daughter got out first. She looked thinner than I remembered, and tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. My son-in-law got out of the passenger side, which struck me. He'd always been a man who needed to drive. My granddaughter came last, from the back seat, and when she saw me she didn't smile, exactly, but something in her face changed. Like she was relieved and braced at the same time. I stood on the porch. My daughter said, "Hi, Dad." I said, "Hello." There was a pause in which 11 years sat between us like furniture. Neither of us wanted to move. She said they'd been driving through the area. She said they'd heard I'd bought a place on the lake. She said she'd been meaning to reach out, that things had been hard, that she thought maybe it was time. My son-in-law shook my hand. His grip was different, softer. I invited them in because my granddaughter was standing there looking at the lake, and she was 16, and none of this was her fault. They stayed for dinner. By the time Gord and Margot and the others left, it was dark. We sat around the kitchen table, the four of us, and for a while it was almost ordinary. My granddaughter ate 2 bowls of chili and asked about the dock and whether the fishing was any good. I told her it was decent for bass in the evenings. She said she'd never fished before. I told her that was something we could fix. My daughter was quiet through most of it, watching me the way you watch someone you're trying to relearn. My son-in-law was the one who brought it up. He said they were in a difficult situation. He said the Ottawa house had become too expensive. He said they'd been thinking about a change, maybe something with more space, more room to breathe. He said he'd noticed I had what looked like at least 3 bedrooms here. I set down my coffee cup. I looked at him. He said, and I want to get this right because I replayed it in my head for days afterwards. He said, "We figured you could probably use the company living out here on your own." My granddaughter was looking at the table. My daughter was looking at her hands. I said, "Is that right?" He said yes, that it seemed like a natural solution, that we could work out the details, that there was no rush. I said I'd think about it. What I did not say, what I had already decided, months before they pulled into my driveway, before I even fully knew they were coming, because at 64 you develop a sense for these things, was everything else. I didn't sleep much that night, not from distress. I want to be clear about that. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the lake and went through what I knew and what I still needed to confirm. I had been a contractor for 40 years. You don't manage job sites, subcontractors, permits, union reps, municipal inspectors, and the occasional client who believes a verbal agreement isn't a contract. You don't do all of that without learning how to stay level when someone is trying to move the ground under your feet. What I knew, my son-in-law had lost his job, yes. What I also knew, because the neighbour had told me, and because I had made a few quiet calls in the months prior, was that it wasn't a simple layoff. He'd been let go for cause, something involving expensed items that hadn't been properly authorised. The company hadn't pursued it formally, but word gets around in a city the size of Ottawa. I also knew, and this was the part that had kept me careful, that 2 years prior, Someone had applied for a line of credit at a Desjardins branch in Gatineau using documentation that included my name. The application hadn't gone through. There had been a flag on the file that the credit officer had caught. I'd been notified, looked into it, decided there wasn't enough to act on at the time. But I'd kept the paperwork. I had also, 3 weeks before this visit, had my lawyer quietly confirm one other thing. My daughter had, at some point in the last 4 years, updated the beneficiary designations on a life insurance policy in her name. A policy I had taken out for her when she was a teenager. One I'd continued to fund well into her adulthood because I am, at my core, a man who cannot stop himself from providing. The beneficiary had been changed from her daughter, my granddaughter, to her husband. My granddaughter to her husband. My granddaughter did not know this. I was quite certain of that. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about a lot of things. In the morning I made breakfast. I made eggs and back bacon and put a pot of tea on because my daughter had always preferred tea to coffee. My granddaughter came downstairs first in socks and an oversized sweater, and I handed her a mug without asking, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked out at the water and said quietly, "It's nice here." I said, "It is." She said, "Did you build it?" I said, "No, I'd bought it, but I'd fixed a few things." She said, "Mom says you used to build houses." I said I'd built a lot of things over the years. She looked at me in a way that was very much like the way her grandmother used to look at me, straight on, without any of the sideways quality that people get when they're deciding how much of themselves to show. She said, "I'm sorry about everything. I don't really know what happened. No one ever told me." I said, "That's not something for you to be sorry about." She went back to looking at the water. My son-in-law came down 20 minutes later in the clothes he'd worn the day before. He helped himself to coffee without asking, which was fine. It's my kitchen and coffee is coffee, but the way he did it told me something. He moved like a man who had already decided where things stood. My daughter came last. She sat across from me and we drank our tea, and she looked like someone who had rehearsed something and forgotten it. I let the silence go for a little while. Then I said, "I had a good lawyer look over some things recently. I want to talk to you about a few of them. Just the two of us, if that's okay." My son-in-law looked up. I looked back at him in a friendly way and said, "Family stuff, you understand." He didn't say anything. My granddaughter asked if she could go sit on the dock. I said, "Of course." I told her there was a rod in the shed, second shelf, already rigged. My daughter and I sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours. I told her what I knew about the credit application. I told her I hadn't pursued it then because I wasn't certain, and because I was still, even after years of silence, trying to extend something that probably should have been taken back sooner. I told her I had confirmed it since, and that there was a paper trail that my lawyer held copies of. I watched her face move through several things. I told her about the insurance policy. I told her that I was not angry, that anger was not the word for what I felt, but that her daughter was 16 years old and deserved to have something secured for her future that didn't pass through hands that had already demonstrated a willingness to treat financial documents as negotiable. My daughter was crying by this point, not dramatically, just the quiet, held-in kind that is somehow harder to watch. I told her I'd already contacted the insurance company and begun the process of transferring the policy into a trust with my granddaughter as the sole named beneficiary and myself as trustee until she turned 25. My lawyer had prepared the documents. It was, for all practical purposes, done. I told her I was not going to press charges over the credit application, provided certain conditions were met. 1. My son-in-law was not to be involved in any financial decision-making that touched my granddaughter's life. 2. My granddaughter would finish her program. If the Ottawa house had to go, she would come here, to the lake house, and I would enroll her in the regional school, which was a good school, and she would have the desk I had already put in the second bedroom. 3. My daughter was welcome here. The door that had been closed for 11 years, I was opening it, but it had a threshold now, and the threshold was her daughter. My daughter said, "What about?" and then stopped. I said, "That's between you and him. I'm not in that marriage." She wiped her eyes. She looked out at the dock where her daughter had apparently found the rod and was standing at the end of it, casting badly and not minding at all. My daughter said, "She looks like Mom." I said, "I know." My son-in-law took the news the way men like him always take news they weren't expecting. First with dismissal, then with a kind of recalibrating stillness, then with an attempt to reassert something that wasn't there anymore. He said I had no right. He said this was a family matter and I had been absent from it. He said the credit thing was a misunderstanding, that he could explain it, that I was making accusations. I said I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I had stated facts. My lawyer had the documentation. If he wanted to explain it to her, he could do that, or to the relevant authorities, if it came to that. That was his choice. He said I was trying to break up his family. I said his family was standing on a dock learning to fish, and I thought she was doing all right. He left 2 hours later. I watched his car go down the gravel road from the kitchen window. My daughter sat in the living room saying nothing for a long time. She stayed the week. That was 8 months ago now. My granddaughter finished the semester at her Ottawa school and moved into the lake house in January. She has strong opinions about what to have for dinner and a habit of leaving her socks on the stairs, and she is, I think, the best thing I have produced in 64 years, which is a strange thing to discover this late, but there it is. She got into the regional school's art program on the strength of a portfolio she put together on a second-hand tablet I found at a shop in Sorrel Tracy. She has already, in 8 months, made friends the way some people do, effortlessly, without seeming to try, the way her grandmother used to walk into a room. My daughter comes on weekends when she can. She and her husband are separated now, formally, through lawyers. She doesn't talk about him much, and I don't ask. What I see is that she sleeps better when she's here. She sits on the dock in the morning with her tea, and something in her shoulders is different than it was in September. I changed the beneficiary on my own estate documents too, while I was at it. My granddaughter should know that someone built something and kept it safe for her. That's all an inheritance really is. We went fishing last Sunday, the 3 of us, just before the lake closed for the season. My granddaughter caught a smallmouth bass that she held up like she'd won something, grinning in a way I hadn't seen on a face in a very long time, and my daughter laughed, and I stood there on the dock with the cold coming in off the water and thought, there it is. That's the thing I was trying to get back to. I didn't sell the knowledge. That's what I kept telling myself through all those years of silence and all those early mornings alone with the accounts and the contracts and the slow, patient work of building something that couldn't be taken. I sold the company, yes, I sold the name eventually, but the knowledge of how to get up and keep going that I kept, and now apparently I'm teaching it again. There's a thing that happens when you stand on a dock in October with someone you almost lost for good. You stop needing to explain anything. My granddaughter held up that base with both hands and laughed, and I thought, this is what it cost. 11 years, a lot of early mornings, and the decision, made quietly and without any audience, to keep going anyway. I thought a lot about what actually turned the story around. It wasn't the lawyer, it wasn't the documents. Those were just tools. What turned it around was something that had been building for a long time before any of this. The slow accumulation of choices made when no one was watching and there was nothing to gain from making them right except the fact of having made them right. 40 years of showing up to job sites when it was -20. 40 years of paying what I owed on time. Keeping my word with subcontractors who had no leverage over me, treating the apprentices the way I'd wanted to be treated when I was young and didn't know anything. That's not virtue in any grand sense. It's just the arithmetic of how you build a life that can hold weight. My son-in-law believed, I think, that I was a soft target, an older man living alone, estranged from his only child, no one in his corner. He had looked at what was visible, the silence, the distance, the years of me not pushing back, and decided it was weakness. That's a mistake people make. Stillness is not the same as having nothing left. I had spent 11 years getting very clear on what I knew, what I was willing to do, and what I was not going to let happen to my granddaughter. That clarity is not something you can buy or inherit. You earn it by staying honest with yourself when it would be easier not to. My daughter made choices I still don't fully understand. I'm not sure she fully understands them either. But I watched her sit on that dock in the mornings with her tea, shoulders slowly unknotting, and I thought, she is trying to find her way back to something she recognizes. That takes its own kind of courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just shows up quietly and keeps showing up until the thing is done. What I want my granddaughter to understand, and maybe she already does, in the way that young people sometimes understand things they haven't lived yet, is that a life worth living is mostly just the sum of those small, unglamorous decisions. Whether to tell the truth when it costs something, whether to think carefully before acting, or to act on the first emotion that walks through the door, whether to keep going on the mornings when there's no particular reason to. She's 16, she has a long way to go, but she's already standing on the dock, casting badly and not minding at all. That's the thing I kept through all of it, and now apparently it's hers.